The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
I'd like to welcome everybody back to part two. What's been, I think, a great show so far in part one. We're fortunate, and you've heard about his resume and his view, bird's eye view of history going back literally to the Reagan administration. His anecdotes and stories obviously were great. But we had to, regrettably, as we have a half-hour time slot, we had to break off. But we do want to continue in part two with his doctoral dissertation of the history of the State of Israel, its conflicts through the years with the Arab nations, and primarily its West Bank with Palestine and Palestinians, an issue that's not going away. It hasn't gone away in my lifetime. And, of course, finish up with, again, the terrorist attack by Hamas, killing women and children and civilians, and the now response by the Israeli armed forces. A dangerous moment for the entire world, really, obviously the Middle East especially. And we will continue and finish part two today. So thanks for joining us.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial. The area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Welcome back, Jonathan. This actually is part two. Your interview is so important, especially as we really got to get into this Hamas issue with Israel, that we needed a little more time, and thank you for indulging us. So please continue where you left off.
Anyway, you have Israeli governments, especially under both parties, actually, both sides, but especially under the Likud, encouraging more settlements in the West Bank, the land that the Arabs wanted for a Palestinian state. And more settlements come in there. It's going to be harder and harder to separate the Jews and the Arabs. So then you have a government now that is the most conservative government in Israeli history,
right,
with people with ministers who really want to annex all the land, or even expel the Arabs. And there was one case where one of the ministers called for leveling a town because a murderer came from that town. And Palestinians themselves see it harder and harder to their dream of their own state. It becomes smaller and smaller. Right. And finally, and I don't know what triggered the attack from Hamas, but at the same time, though, the soldiers who should have been guarded on the on the Gaza border, they had this impenetrable fortress like the Maginot Line, right, from World War II, where the French line that was going to be impenetrable, and the Nazis overran it very quickly.
Yeah, there's no such thing, but go ahead, yeah.
Right. They had a fence around Gaza and concrete and watchtowers, but Israel took its eye off Gaza. They thought that it was going to be quiet. They were allowing more Palestinians into Israel to work. I think Qatar, if I'm not mistaken, one of the Arab nations promised a lot more money to pay people in Gaza. And they figured economically it would be better. Gaza's not going to do anything. And the government turns its attention to the West Bank, protecting these illegal settlements that have sprung up,
right,
having clashes with Palestinians in the West Bank. They don't like the policies. They're being dealt with harder, and they bemoan the fact they'll ever have a state of their own.
Right.
So Gaza, and then you have the government trying to change the character of Israel, trying to take away the Supreme Court's power to overrule the government, which, like our Supreme Court, right, whether you like the Supreme Court or not, it has the power to tell the president no. Right. But the same thing in Israel. And Israel does not have a written constitution at all. They basically, over the years, through basic laws and the Supreme Court, have basically, this is how the government's going to be working. And, their Supreme Court's not appointed by a president. They have an independent group of experts and legal minds that nominate people to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in a country without a constitution is the only guardian of rights.
Right.
And the right-wing government wants to strip the Supreme Court of certain power, especially to overrule certain government edicts, which mean the government could do whatever it wanted. There'd be no check on its power.
Right.
And that until you have reservists saying they're not going to serve under a autocracy. You have people on strike. You have government officials not going to work. You have protests. It'd be if you had one of those big Vietnam protests in '69, right? 500,000 people were in Washington. If you had that every day in Israel or every week in Israel for months. So they took their eye off the Gaza, and Hamas decided this is the time to strike.
It had to have crossed their minds that if they did this, Israeli would come in and effectively destroy most of the Gaza Strip, and then it would invade, which is still being talked about as imminent. And that if Israel does that, they will take back the Gaza Strip. And, like, how would that figure to advance the cause of Islam, of radical Islam, let me be clear, of that terrorist group, which Hamas is? They like to masquerade as, no, we're a political party. No, they're a terrorist group, as you've read from their manifesto. I haven't heard anything like that since I read Mein Kampf when Hitler was in jail, what his view of Jews were. That didn't go well for the world. So it's a terrorist group. So they had to know if they pulled the pin in this grenade, they could get wiped out. So I'm going to ask you to try to put your mind in, what could the possible end game? Don't, like chess, don't you have to have an end game for when you do something? Just please tell us what you think their end game was.
Well, after Rabin died, and if you remember at the funeral, you had all these nations showing up that ordinarily used to ostracize Israel, and the first time the world was coming to the funeral of the Prime Minister of Israel, and Israel was going to continue making peace with the Palestinians, and then a terrorist group of Passover Seder, and Netanyahu got to win the prime minister because people were scared, and he basically rolled back those efforts to peace. Here you have talk that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Israel are going to have this massive peace treaty, which part of it, something for the Palestinians, but it doesn't say there's going to be a Palestinian state. I don't know the details. There was concern among the Palestinians that they were going to be left out. Remember, the Abraham Accords don't involve the Palestinians. They involve Israel making peace with other Arab nations with nothing for the Palestinians. Right. And so if you're a Palestinian, you're living in with barbed wire and a blockade because you elected a government that calls for wiping out every Jew, but you're still living in that West Bank. There's settlement after settlements. There are people dying, being shot and killed by Israeli forces. And now you might have a peace settlement, which would isolate Iran, which is Hamas's patron.
Yes. And
basically forever end the Arab-Israeli conflict. Right. So if that, again, I don't know what's in the mind, but that would be a logical thought. Now, yes, Israel can come in. Now, Israel has all the sympathy of most of the world.
Just about all the world.
Yeah, except for a few members of Congress, and except for
like Imam Omar and a few of the squad radicals.
Well, Ilhan Omar, and the story I wrote, there was a vote in July to condemn anti-Semitism and say Israel's not an apartheid or a racist state. And there were 9 House Democrats that voted no on that. And of the 9 Democrats that voted no, 5 of them condemned Hamas by name, including Ilhan Omar, including Leonardo Ocasio-Cortez, including Summer Lee from Pittsburgh.
Right.
And a 6th one condemned the murder of innocents without naming the murder of children without naming Hamas by name. Right. So I thought that was very significant, something I wrote on that.
Right.
But you go into Gaza, you're going to be blowing up buildings. You're going to be killing civilians because you don't know. I mean, we know for a fact that Hamas hides its weapon systems in schools and churches and mosques, and
don't they have something called terrorist tunnels? Don't they have something called
that,
terrorist tunnels as well there?
but not even talking about the tunnels.
Right.
You're launching a missile from a school.
Right.
Or if you blow up the missile, you're blowing up a school.
Right.
They're launching a missile from a mosque. If you blow up the missile site, you're blowing up a mosque. They're launching missiles from apartment buildings. If you blow up an apartment building, you're blowing up, if you blow a missile site, you're killing maybe thousands of innocent civilians.
Right.
And you could turn the tide against Israel because they're coming in there and killing civilians, which in a ground war, one of the reasons Israel's never fought a lengthy ground war, they let Hamas exist, is because they don't want they're not only their casualties, but the civilian casualties of the Gazans.
Sure.
And that's still the issue. Right now, people are on Israel's side. What if the headlines say 2,000 children killed when Israel blows up a school? The headline's not going to say Israel blows up a missile factory, and which is hidden behind a school. It's going to say Israel blew up a school.
Yeah, there's no question.
And either way, those kids are dead. Those civilians are dead. Right. So that's always been the problem with Israel and the Gaza Strip. And the question is, what do you do from that? Now, Tom Friedman of the New York Times says everybody expects you to do that. Israel should zig instead of zag. What now, if you announce you're going to set up a Palestinian state with money from Saudi Arabia, with money from Qatar, with money from the other Arab countries, and you could set up the militarized state and give the Palestinians what they want, with the hope that that'll quell any, if you set up a state in the West Bank and let civilians from the Gaza go over there, then the only people left in Gaza are terrorists. But basically the idea is maybe this is the time, you hate to say, reward terrorism, but Tom Friedman's saying maybe this is the time, instead of going back in and having all these casualties, you try something different.
Right.
And that's the question for Israel's cabinet now. After they get some military revenge.
Sure. So what exactly, again, for audience, what would that question be that they're debating right now in Parliament, the Israeli Parliament?
Israel set up called a war cabinet. The opposition party, the head of the opposition party, and the current Prime Minister Netanyahu, basically, and a couple of other really experienced commanders. In Israel, everybody serves in the army. So after you serve in the army, you want to go into government, you have military background. Today, in America, there are a lot of people that aren't military veterans. It used to be everybody served. During World War II, everybody served. Chris DeLuzio, for example, is one of those who served in the Navy. In fact, Iraq war veteran. And he's serving in Congress, that they're members of both parties. But they're fewer and fewer in America. In Israel, everybody served in the army. So they're all veterans. And a lot of them, especially the commanders, go into politics afterwards. Right. And you've got those people now planning what to do. And Israel is, they said, we'll put a tighten the noose around Gaza, but then the United Nations says that's violation of international law. You can't have lay a siege to a civilian population. Right. Things like that happening, it loses Israel some of the sympathy that they have. You go in there and go door to door, civilians are going to be killed. Well, what do you do? I don't know what to do, and that's what they're debating now. Right. How do you wipe out Hamas, or at least weaken it so it can't threaten? Right. But you don't do anything. But remember, though, Hamas came with those hang gliders, and they came with missiles. Right. They get billions of dollars a year in aid. It didn't go to build schools and factories.
No, it was for munitions.
Went to build bombs and missiles.
Right. Yeah, they get it. My understanding is they get stuff from a sympathetic state in Turkey, Qatar. They get money and munitions from Iran. Now we have the complicated issue of, because we're trying to negotiate, as you're well aware, this nuclear arms deal treaty to stop them from weaponizing uranium in Iran so they don't become another disastrous nuclear power in the Middle East. So part of that give and take is $6 billion or so in funds that we were going to unfreeze for Iran, when in fact, you can make the definite connection argument that money helps go toward them funding the terrorism they've been funding with the Hamas in the Gaza Strip.
Well, today they held up the $6 billion, the release of the $6 billion.
$6 billion.
I think $6 billion.
Yeah,
it's not going. It's not going to be released. But that money was money that Iran. It was Iran's money that South Korea had frozen. So it's not like you're giving them money; it's their money.
Oh,
but
okay.
They had frozen it, and the deal was that the money would be released, like for food and humanitarian purposes. So, like Iran would have to, like, almost say, "Here, I need $5 million to buy food," and they'd have to approve the expenditure and make sure it was spent on that. I don't know all the details on that.
Okay.
But basically, that was the thing that supposedly was the deal. It wasn't we're going to write them a check for $6 billion, and on the bottom of the check says, "Please don't spend this on bombs." It wasn't that.
Well, that obviously gives us some more comfort. You know,
and the Secretary of State said over the weekend, this is last weekend now, that none of the money had been released yet. So it wasn't like Iran took this money and started sending it to Hamas to buy bombs.
Right. Like, what's an exit strategy? Like doing your best, which is difficult to unwind and get at the terrorists because they've hidden themselves, as you point out, in the civilian community, in schools and places. They have that problem, Israel. But then how do you get a certain amount of rightful vengeance for all of the innocent women and children and Israelis that were innocently and dastardly killed? You know, how do you do that? And then at the same time, ease tension in the area for peace, when anything you almost do would be viewed as appeasement to aggression. But, you know.
That's part of the problem. That's the conundrum.
Yes.
What do you do? But, you know, you see the statements of people, and there's some statements that were clearly, you know, yay, Palestine, and Israel got its deserve. But there are a lot of other folks, including, you know, members of the squad, who said, this is terrible. You don't butcher women and children. But the Palestinians have been living in a hellhole for decades, right. And you can understand why they would explode. Right. I mean, you know, so you can understand something like that. The cauldron that burns over, right. It gets too hot to handle, exactly. And they feel hopeless. And if you're hopeless, you do anything. Again, I don't know how it gets resolved. Do you get? Certainly, the current government would never make peace, but they might lose the next election because of what happened on their watch. Does that government make peace? You get a majority of people. Israel, do you get an overwhelming vote for peace? Right. I don't know if you get that. Maybe people have to say, we got to do something. We have to set something up. And again, Israel withdraws from Hamas. They got rockets. Right. So so why would you withdraw from the West Bank too? What guarantee do you have that you don't get rockets from the West Bank also then? Right. Exactly. Remember, right. Hamas is not occupied territory. There are a lot of Jews who will argue that the West Bank is not occupied either. It's Judea and Samaria, biblical lands that Israel took rightfully, and it should be rightfully part of Israel. But there's definitely no Israeli presence in Gaza. Right. And you still read all about the occupation of Gaza. There's no occupation. Right.
Exactly right. Well, let me get you out on this, Jonathan. I think from a human interest point, I had mentioned, and I want to just finish with, your family connection to the holy city of Jerusalem, and so this has a little more personal meaning for you. This is why I appreciate so much your time in talking about it. But talk about your family's connection to Israel and the holy city, Jerusalem, and the like.
My great-great-great-grandfather, Samuel Salant, emigrated from Salant, Lithuania, to Jerusalem in the 1840s and became the chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi community. That's the Jews from Eastern Europe, and was there for till the early 1900s. And he was the leader of the community. And my grandparents emigrated here from Jerusalem. So all my father's family is still in Israel. Some of them serving in the war. My cousin is in touch with them. He said that they were all safe, though none of them were in the areas that were attacked by Hamas.
Right. Well, God bless.
And there's a street in Jerusalem, the Asherim section of Jerusalem, the ultra Orthodox area. That's Salant Street.
From your family, there's a connection to your family
Yes.
for that? Wow.
Yes.
Well, you know, as I said, your accomplishments in life know no bounds, apparently, Jonathan. I want to thank you personally for your time educating me and many of our audience. You have an insight that they can't even get in the New York Times, very frankly. So you've honored me with your presence and your time. And because of your family connections to Israel, Godspeed and God bless for their safe health. And the world hopes this matter gets resolved. Tomorrow the sun's going to come up, and there's going to have to be, in the day after that, we're going to have to learn to live together at some point. So I hope that occurs.
Well, thank you, and feel free to invite me back anytime.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. I fully intend to take you up on that. I enjoyed your company. Thank you. It seems like there is nothing left in mainstream culture that can escape the myopic and ignorant attack of progressivism. Today's topic is the extent to which the ghost of paranoid and censured 1950 Senator Joseph McCarthy has virulently affected the progressive left and their all-out assault on the arts. The very same paranoia, now from a different point on the ideological spectrum, the left, that McCarthy conducted over 70 years ago against communism. We have all heard about these recent attacks on children's books, as well as movies and just about anything else that has been written, spoken, or sung. Heck, the left has even tried to cancel Dr. Seuss and reimagine just about every single Walt Disney movie, all the way back to Snow White. Now back to the comparison of the progressive left to references of the worst excesses of McCarthyism and the far right. During this view, I will quote extensively from an article by Peter Tonguette in the Washington Examiner, in an article entitled "The Paranoid Style in Liberal Criticism." Tonguette writes, I quote, "This conviction that paranoia is the exclusive providence of the right remains such an article of faith among the left that the evils of old-school McCarthyism were routinely trotted out well into the 21st century. Yet, in one of those strange ironies of history, it is the left that today walks in fear of at least half the population. Like their anti-communist forebears, the current left paranoids are wild-eyed, certain of their own rightness, and far too voracious in their pursuit of alleged evidence of extremism." End quote. Tonguette gives several examples of progressive extremism. The first is a movie, Sound of Freedom, which had tremendous box office success, north of $200 million, even though it competed amid the summer movie season dominated by Barbie dolls and atomic bombs. The movie dealt with a story starring Jim Caviezel as a Department of Homeland Security agent, whose mandate includes pursuing sex traffickers who target children. Caviezel's character is frustrated by red tape and sets up operation in South America, not only to bring the traffickers to justice, but also to free all the children who have already been kidnapped or tricked into sex trafficking rings. The movie is bereft of moral gray areas and does not stray from its central issue of liberating exploited children. It's impossible not to cheer on Caviezel as he destroys the bad guys and reunites parents with their children. This had been the kind of movie that Hollywood normally celebrates, as it had obviously resonated with millions of moviegoers who bought tickets. However, in the midst of our current culture wars, this was not the case. I'm quoting Tonguette again. Quote, "Generally speaking, when a movie becomes a sleeper hit, Hollywood reacts by trying to ape its success. But in this case, the industry has tried to explain away its popularity. Perniciously, many commentators have claimed that the movie is kind of a vessel for some vaguely defined QAnon ideology. The warning has been sounded by all the usual suspects. Quote, QAnon supporters are promoting Sound of Freedom, end quote. Or the Nations, who quoted, Sound of Freedom is a QAnon fever dream. Rolling Stones, Sound of Freedom, box office triumph for QAnon believers. As far as I can see, though, the movie itself has nothing to do with QAnon, Al-Anon, or the anonymous author of the Clinton-era satirical novel Primary Colors, or the artist formerly known as Prince. Ironically, Sound of Freedom obviously belongs to the honorable, if rather tedious, tradition of do-gooder message movie. Traditionally a liberal genre exemplified by such pictures as The Defiant Ones, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, The Day After, and Philadelphia. Like those sanctimonious films, Sound of Freedom is more a work of propaganda than art, but its makers erred in choosing a cause that has lost favor with the left. Child trafficking is no joke, but to our cultural commissars, to care about the subject makes one a stooge of the MAGA movement, end quote. Wow. The progressive left could make McCarthy look sympathetic. I will now turn to music. The second example concerns a music video from Jason Aldean entitled, Try That in a Small Town. A song that weighs in against abhorrent acts, such as carjacking old ladies, robbing liquor stores, and screaming profanities at police officers. It's hard to argue with the song's theme, that small-town ethos would inveigh against such bad behavior. I will now quote Tonguette again. Begin quote. Yet, because Aldean's music video illustrated the lyrics by incorporating footage of real crimes, including flag burning, civilian harassment of police, and general rioting, it was said to have been irredeemably racist. CMT said so long to the video. Even its filming location was deemed problematic. Nearly a century ago, a lynching had taken place at the same courthouse in Columbia, Tennessee, where Aldean's video was filmed. But it does not occur to the paranoid mindset that Aldean was not responsible for securing the location. By their reckoning, the only explanation can be that he has hate in his heart. The notion that Aldean merely objects to civil disorder and that the courthouse was chosen for its aesthetic value is dismissed, ignored, skipped past as an inconvenient truth, or at least a plausible one, end quote. Tonguette theorizes that the paranoids on the left have gone beyond trying to cancel or vilify anything that could possibly produce a trigger warning, as Hollywood has begun to eat its own. They are even trying to cancel one of the nation's best stand-up comics, Dave Chappelle, who was African American, for his send-ups on cancel culture or expressing empathy for voters from his home state of Ohio who support Trump, or daring to touch transgender-related material. Actually, Chappelle is merely funny, edgy, provocative, and outrageous, as Richard Pryor and Lenny Bruce were before him. I will now end with another direct quote from Tonguette. Begin quote. According to the paranoid style and liberal criticism, however, nothing is ever what it seems. A movie about child trafficking can't be just that. A song rallying behind small-town values has to have some covert meaning. A comedian who speaks the unspeakable must be working for the other side. This is a new breed of McCarthyism, arguably worse than the original, because McCarthy was discredited in his own time. But the current wave of paranoid delusion is being practiced right out in the open. The idea that movies, songs, and comedians who appeal to millions harbor secret agendas is preposterous. End quote. There you have it.